For coming. My name is Bob Porzio. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a member of the Adult Faith Formation Team. And just want to give you a little background on Father Grogan. He's going to talk on changing the conversation, the good news about Catholic marriage. And there is good news. He's the parochial vicar at Our Lady of Good Counsel in Morristown, New Jersey. And I'll tell you, he's certainly qualified to give this talk. He's a widower, a father of 3 sons, and a Catholic priest. So you got everything you all know. He has a bachelor's degree from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia and a master's degree from Villanova University in Villanova, Pennsylvania. He also has 2 other master's degrees, one in pastoral theology from LaSalle University in Philly, and another one in systematic theology from Immaculate Conception Seminary in Seton Hall. Father James Grogan.
Thank you, and thank you, Bob, for having me invited to come out this evening. You heard that biography, and my LaSalle alma mater is the only one not playing in March Madness. St. Joe's, Villanova, Seton Hall. I got 3 people to root for, although I think Villanova and St. Joe's might knock each other out in the second round if they get that far. I think they're going to play each other. So we're here to talk about the good news about Catholic marriage. Now, that seems almost a phrase that we don't hear a lot of. You know, it's like, well, what do you mean the good news? Well, by the time we're done tonight, you'll know that there's 2 things that we need to focus on. One, there is actually a lot of good news about marriage, and especially about Catholic marriage. And secondly, you are all going to be ambassadors to help make that message brought out to the world. Okay? Starting right here in, St. Gregory the Great Parish. So I invite you to be deputized at the end of this thing to correct people on some things that they may say about Catholic marriages that frankly are not true. So Bob gave a little bit of an introduction about me. It confuses people. Sometimes when I go as a visiting priest to neighboring parishes and I jump into my homily and they think they're in a Catholic church and I say something about my sons and suddenly you see the crowd freeze. It's like, oh, wait a minute. So I was happily married for 25 years. I was ordained as a permanent deacon in 2004. And at that time, I was enjoying my ministry, spending a lot of my day job was working in the business world, where technology and business meet. Spent 35 years doing that. Shortly after my ordination as the permanent diaconate, my wife developed cancer, fought a wonderful almost 2-year battle with that. And then next thing I know, here I am raising 3 teenage and almost young adult sons back in 2007. As they started to grow into young men, a few years later I said, what do I do with the rest of my life? What do I do with the second half of my life, as it were? And as my oldest son will frequently say, he said, Dad, every time we saw you doing that deacon stuff, you seemed like you were the happiest. So I was drawn into that ministry, drawn into the opportunity then to continue on this path, serving God's people, and became a Catholic priest. So here I am. I knew Father Michael, your pastor, when he was a newly ordained priest. He served in my home parish for a couple years, right out of the bishop's ordination. So I know him well, and I thank him for inviting me to come visit with you this evening. So let's get into this presentation. My starting point, I know Father Michael is a canon lawyer, so I'm going to begin with the problem of canon law. And it's really not a problem for me. I love canon law, okay? First of all, did all of you are baptized? Yes? Okay. Did all of you know that you are bound by canon law from that moment as an infant in your baptism? Have any of you studied it? Okay, a little bit, so I have to be careful what I say. Okay. So the first canon that has to do with marriage is Canon 1055. And what Canon 1055 says, and I'm going to read this for you in case your glasses in the back can't follow it. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership for the whole of life, which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. Whew. So what is the problem there? That sounds pretty reasonable to any canon lawyers in the room. The problem is that we don't understand that. Through our baptism, we're bound by canon law, and it has a lot of language in it. It's like, well, what does that mean to me? So the phrase that we're going to look at in some depth here is the whole of life. That first canon of the canon section about matrimony talks about the whole of life. And most of us, when we hear that phrase, the whole of life, in the context of marriage, we generally immediately are thinking, at the bride and groom standing there at the altar, and they're saying, "Till death do us part." It's a forward-looking thing. It's going out into the future about the life that we're going to spend together. But that's a little bit of a misunderstanding. And it will become clear as we talk about this in the nature of how we speak to little kids as they talk about marriage. It's misapplied, and it becomes an opportunity for conversation. And that's what we're here tonight, to talk about changing the conversation for the good news about Catholic marriage. So we're going to come back to that in a moment about what do we mean by the whole of life. So let's talk about why marriages are struggling here in the 21st century. First, we have a secular versus church contradictions. Okay? In the secular world, well, you can't look anywhere without somebody trying to explain to you or challenge you that marriage being permanent or exclusive or open to children are things that are, aren't they just old-fashioned? Do we really need that in the 21st century? When we look at newspapers, when we look at TV shows, we look at movies, young people, and I do mean young because you're starting to see this for the shows that are for kids, the Saturday morning cartoons are including to show that marriage is disposable. Now, was that a new idea in the 21st century? Well, actually, if you go back to the covenant, the contract of marriage that goes into ancient Rome, back in about the 1st century, marriages were a contract that stood as long as both parties wanted it to stand. And either the husband or the wife could say, "I'm done, I'm out of here." They write a bill of divorce and it's over. So from the earliest time, that contract part of marriage was always subject to people saying, is this for real? Is this for life? So that's part of where our church definition of it, in the very last part of that canon, spoke about this being raised to a sacrament by Jesus Christ between two baptized persons. Well, it's different. And that gets into the second question, the attempts to redefine marriage. When we talk about marriage, we just went through 2 years of the extraordinary synod on families in Rome, right? And in those synods, we've had all kinds of questions, and the media has, in some cases, said, "Let me explain to you what they're doing in Rome," which may or may not have been actually what they were doing in Rome. But part of what they were saying is, the synod has to come out with a new way of the church looking at marriage. Okay. Maybe a new way of looking at marriage, but even in the final documents that came out of the second extraordinary synod, guess what? They didn't change one I, dot one I, or cross one T of different theology of marriage. So where is the theology of our marriage rooted? When we talk about that permanence, exclusivity, and open to children, it's rooted in St. Augustine in the 5th century. And it really hasn't changed in all those years. But we do have a different way of understanding it. So the challenge that I'd offer you here when we talk about these attempts to redefine marriage, sometimes for us to make sure we're claiming that in the right context, in the secular sections of the world that we sometimes interact with, maybe you need to just put in front of marriage when you're talking about it as sacramental marriage. Because in our church life, that's really what we're talking about. That's why we claim our definition of marriage, our definition of what makes a marriage, and the theology that underlies that being about 1700 years old when you go back to it being defined by St. Augustine. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about something that got redefined by the Supreme Court of the United States last year. That was them usurping a word that has a meaning far deeper than any government entity can wrap around it. We talked about the media and the entertainment. I have a wonderful goddaughter, okay? She's a lector in her parish. She's a young woman who is active in her church. And I watched yesterday on her Facebook page as she got all excited about having this party around The Bachelor, a TV show which is, for lack of a better term, just this big dating thing that makes it entertainment of people just trying to figure out who we're going to marry. You know, we're doing this for fun, and we're going off onto these wild and crazy dates. We say, wait, you know, what they're showing on TV in prime time, that's really not what we say is the character of what a Christian marriage should be, what a Catholic marriage should be. But that's what we're seeing out there. That's what you and I and all of our friends are seeing on TV and movies, et cetera, okay? Let's make sure this is off. So half of all marriages end in divorce. How many have seen this statement? Okay. Does anybody recall where you may have seen it or heard it?
It's probably some fabrication. I think people just say that.
Okay. Well, some people just say that, but anybody know where you might have seen it said?
I think I saw the Trenton Times this past week. They said
Okay. Trenton Times?
of marriage and divorce.
How many people think the Trenton Times is a real valuable literary resource? And I'm not taking shots at you reading that. It's a good thing to read. Okay. How about, this has been a headline in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek Magazine. Okay. This has been said since 1974. Quoted. It's true. It's not true. Never was true. It's bad arithmetic. This number, and I'll show you in a slide, comes from a report by the United States Census Bureau. In that very same report, and they began in 1974 tracking statistics about the demographics of society. One of the things they began tracking that year were the number of marriages and the number of divorces that took place in 1974. Guess what? In 1974, there were twice as many marriages as there were divorces. Now, in first or second grade arithmetic, you started to learn fractions, maybe third grade. If I put twice as many marriages on the bottom as the denominator, as the number of divorces as the numerator, and do the arithmetic, that comes up with 50%. And that says 50% of all marriages end in divorce, right? Let me ask how, Bob mentioned I'm from Our Lady of Good Counsel down in Burlington County. Am I in New York Giants or Philadelphia sports area, coverage area? What, divided, okay. Split. Should I use a New York example or a Philly example? New York. Okay, I'll go with New York even though I really don't like New York. I'm a Philly kid. So a New York example, okay? Giants 14, New York Giants 14, New York Yankees 7. Who's winning? Right, they never play each other. The scores don't matter. You're mixing things that don't matter, and that's exactly what happened here. When I say the number of divorces in 1 year divided by the number of marriages in 1 year, it is a completely meaningless statistic. The number of divorces in that year were based on some marriages that took place either earlier that year or 5 years, 10 years, 50 years before that. The number of marriages that year are marriages that may last for the next 5, 10, 15, 50. I was with a woman today who was 78 years married. Okay? Wonderful woman in the nursing home. That's how long the marriage might last. So where does she fit in that statistic? Well, if she got married in 1974, which 74 from 2016, that was 42 years ago. So people who are married 42 years this year, and there are a lot of them, were married in 1974 when this statistic began, and they're still married. Okay? So what does the census report really tell us? It didn't just track that, it tracked the actual counts of marriages. And we go back to 2009, which was actually the last year that the U.S. Census Bureau tracked this. And I don't know why they stopped tracking it, maybe because it was the secular attempt to redefine marriage, and they're not quite sure what to even call it when they measure it nowadays. But in 2009, 73% of married persons have been married only once. That kind of challenges that 50% of marriages end in divorce right out of the get-go. And it's the same report it's coming from. This is not church statistics, from Cara at Georgetown or, a Diocese of Trenton survey. This is the United States Census Bureau. Same report. 55% of persons over 15 years of age, okay, 15 is a weird number to make it, but in some cultures, 15 is when you become an adult. That's why the Census Bureau drew the line there. 55% of the people over 15 years of age were married once, and 30% of the persons over 15 have never married. Again, simple arithmetic. 55 plus 30 is how much? 85. That leaves at most 15% of the population over the age of 15 that have been divorced and remarried. There's actually a country song, "All My Exes Live in Texas." It's true. Texas has the highest rate nationally of people who get married, divorced, married, divorced, married, divorced. So this number of the 15% of the population who are divorced and remarried, sometimes that's a serial problem. Okay. How else do you validate that statistic? If 50% of the people that got married, end in divorce, imagine the last time you sat down at a dinner party among friends and there were, say, 4 couples there. Of those 4 couples, were 2 of them divorced? Probably not. When people start thinking back about the backyard barbecues and their circle of friends that they gather with, and this is not just Catholic friends, this is all your friends. You say, you know what? Half of the couples I know are not divorced. Yes, some of them are. So how many out of 10? And some people say, well, it's like maybe 1 or 2. And 1 or 2 out of 10 is 15%. Big surprise. That's what the Census Bureau said it was. More good news. This comes from the New York Times, which has also been subject to quoting that 50% of marriages end in divorce. Divorce in the United States has never reached 1 in 2 marriages, and with the divorce rates declining, it probably never will. That reaches all the way back to 11 years ago in 2005 when they did a study. According to their statistics, and I'm not sure exactly where they got this because it's not the same Census Bureau report that said half of the marriages end in divorce, because that actually hit 55% at one point. The highest rate that has been measured by the New York Times study was 41%. Okay, so it's not half. This is a wonderful statistic. This guy, Joshua Goldstein, is not Catholic. Joshua's not even Christian. He's a Jewish professor at Princeton University who, reflecting on this, said, the expectations of high divorce rates are in some ways self-fulfilling. That's a partial explanation for why the rates went up in the 1970s. Remember, that's when that statistic first started to be tossed out there. 1974, half of all marriages end in divorce, and you're now telling people, oh, it's disposable. We can throw it away. Why? Well, because half of my neighbors are doing it. Well, they weren't. But the statistic became a seed for people. This is important for what Dr. Goldstein says. As word gets out that the rates have tempered or fallen, it could lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy in the other direction. And that's why when we began here, I said, you're all going to be deputized. After this evening, anytime you're at a cocktail party or a backyard barbecue and you hear somebody say, hey, did you hear that 50% of the marriages in the United States end in divorce? You are now required to tell them, did you know that statistic is wrong and it was never true? What? The New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek, they were all wrong? Lots of people, powerful people, lots of people in our church have used that same statistic, because they've read it in all of those presumably accurate news sources, but they hadn't followed the footnotes back to say, well, where does that statistic come from? And when we look at the census report that it came from, it never was true. It's bad arithmetic. Here's how the arithmetic is broken. The annual count of divorces divided by the annual count of new marriages is a meaningless number. That's like when the Yankees play the Giants. It might happen for a charity softball game with the police department, but it's never a real game. And New York Giants 14, New York Yankees 7 tells you nothing about who's winning. Okay? Not a thing. The annual divorce rates are in a context of all marriages during that year, not the new ones initiated in the year. So this is where they calculated the divorce rate from the U.S. Census Bureau reports. This is how it panned out. And hit about 51% there in the middle 1990s. It's been at that 50% rate. This is 74, where they started to track the statistic more accurately by the Census Bureau. But it's a make-believe number. And yet it's been a headline on big, prestigious magazines and research reports. This comes from 2015, just last year, just about a year ago. Brittany McDonald's a reporter for NBC News. She was looking at her own statistics, and even again, she's looking at the statistics from that same report. So even where those statistics are flawed, her news reporting on them is the divorce peaked in the 70s and 80s, and the divorce rate has dropped to 43%. If current trends continue, nearly 2/3 of marriages will never involve a divorce. Well, she's starting to get the story closer to true. But the Census Bureau report, right up through 2009, the last year it tracked, tells us that 73% of marriages, the people have been married only once. Okay? So she said 2/3, the Census Bureau says 3/4. That's a whole lot better story than 50% of all marriages end in divorce. That's why I ask you, I beg you to become ambassadors to say when you hear somebody sharing that statistic, feel free to tell them that it's a mistake. You can do it politely. You can give them my name and number if you want to just get out of the argument quickly, because I'll be happy to explain to them the arithmetic behind it, which their third grade teacher actually taught them how to do numerators and denominators. Make sense? Let's keep rolling along here. I told you I'd come back to this whole of life. So when we say the whole of life is not from that wedding day going forward, okay? I got married on May 28th, 1982 to my lovely bride, Ellie, okay? In 1982, on May 28th, I was 25 years old. Pictures of my wedding, everybody says, whoever let those two kids get married? They don't look old enough to be allowed out of the house at night, But nevertheless, when I got married, I had 25 years of life that I brought to that marriage, as did my wife. What does that mean, the whole of life? Well, the whole of life means that it begins in the remote preparation. Remote preparation for marriage is something that our diocesan family life office uses when they talk about catechesis and whatnot. There's two different types of marriage preparation. Remote preparation is what begins with infants and toddlers in your households, okay? It begins when that 2-year-old is watching mommy and daddy hold hands. That's beginning preparation for marriage. It's starting to say, oh, that's how husbands and wives love each other. They hold hands. When they get to be 10-year-old boys, you embarrass your kids, Oh, mommy and daddy, you're kissing. My friends saw it. Yeah, that happens, okay? And if the kid's on the bad list, you kiss again just to make them really get upset. But Canon 774.2 says that parents and the catechesis of the faith, it talks about it being the responsibility of parents to teach their children in matters of the faith. Teach them in the matters of what is a sacramental marriage. What does it consist of? Teachers, catechists, priests, deacons, and especially moms and dads have a play in this. When we celebrate Valentine's Day and we let our kids make Valentines, we're teaching them about marriage, believe it or not. When we get a sitter for the kids and go out for our anniversary, even if it's the Burger King, you're teaching your kids about marriage. You're saying, this is important for us to celebrate. And you're teaching them why, hey, half the marriages didn't end in divorce. Because I see my mom and dad and they're happy, you know. Then we get into, so that's the remote preparation of marriage. It begins when we're kids. The proximate preparation for marriage. Proximate is a fancy term that says that it's about time that you get married. It's in the midst of marriage. Here in the diocese, the 5 dioceses in New Jersey, the church has agreed that the preparation time for marriage is approximately 1 year. We ask engaged couples to come to the rectory, talk to the priest, begin that process approximately a year before you get married. And that is the proximate preparation for marriage. And so what do we say to the young adults about the permanence of marriage during that? Well, we have to talk to them. Canon 773 and 1063 use this wonderful phrase, pastors of souls. Okay? Technically, I'm not a pastor of souls. I'm an associate. My pastor, Father Damien, who some of you know from his old days here, he's the pastor of souls in my parish. I have to work for him, and so what he's chartered with by this canon, I am required to assist with. But pastors of souls and the marriage catechesis are the people who have to say, I'm going to sit down with this young bride and groom, I'm going to talk to them about what does it mean to be married for the whole of life? How do we change that conversation? So a young man and a young girl meet. They met 2 years after college on Catholic.com or some such dating website. They fall in love. They're perfectly matched for each other. What is their whole of life? Well, he brings how he behaved at the junior prom in high school to that whole of life. Okay? He brings how he saw his parents, his father especially, treating his mother to that. She brings everything her father told her from the time she was his little princess and she was dancing, standing on the top of his shoes, everything about what her expectations ought to be in the husband that she finds. That's what they bring to that whole of life. They bring that remote preparation, that remote expectation, and they bring that joyful promise of a marriage that ought to be extraordinary. So when you're getting into this proximate preparation, it's time for the priest, the deacon, the mentoring couples, the pre-Cana couples. That's when we help them to realize, hey, do you know what you've been watching all along? Do you know what you've seen from your parents and her parents and your grandparents? And that's what we do in that marriage preparation. We have conversations with them to say, what was your family of origin? How did they practice their marriage? How did they practice their faith? I've prepared probably 50 or 75 couples in my time since I've been a deacon and a priest, okay? And I got to tell you that half of them don't find themselves in a situation to say, oh, my mom and dad are divorced. Some do, yes. But that 50% of marriages end in divorce, it's not true. About 3/4 of those couples, when you have that conversation, they can look back to each of their respective parents, to their grandparents, and say, yeah, you know, my mom and dad are married. You know, if they're both living, that's wonderful. You know, or I remember my grandparents, and yeah, we always went to their house on Sunday night, and that's where we're learning family life. That's where we're learning what it means to be a loving couple and raising children. And guess what? That's where the permanence, exclusivity, and open to children, where the seeds were planted. We don't have to teach them the theology of St. Augustine at this point. But in fact, that's what we are doing. We're sharing with them the essential nature of the sacrament of marriage that has been the same since the 5th century. We're not crafting anything new. The extraordinary synod on the family did not craft anything new. When Pope Francis gave his direction to canon lawyers and tribunals around the world about changing the annulment process, he did not change the theology of marriage. He said, this process of annulment that we already had, you've made it too cumbersome. Let's find ways to simplify the process. But the conditions for annulment didn't change. Okay? So we have opportunities for this transformation of our children. We have opportunities to change the conversation. And I'm here to share with you tonight, I passionately believe, you might be getting that, I passionately believe that there is more good news to share than bad news. And it is time for us to claim that conversation, not just change it, but to claim it. Every marriage, every bride and groom has the right to demand an extraordinary marriage. And I think you have the right to demand that of each other, of yourself, and of your church. If you get ready to get engaged, or you've gotten engaged, and you say, okay, I'm happy with an okay marriage, shame on you. If you raise the bar a little bit and said, I'd like a good marriage, shame on you. You should enter into this wanting an extraordinary marriage, because everyone can have it. There's no limit on it. It's like God's love and mercy. It's not like, we've given out all the extraordinary marriage licenses for this month. Everybody for the last week of the month, you're just going to get ordinary. No, every marriage has the potential to be extraordinary. The question becomes, if you set that as an expectation from youth, now I'm flying in the face of Hollywood. Now I'm flying in the face of People magazine. Now I'm flying in the face of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other places that want to tell the bad news of marriage. It's a better story. It's a good story. It's a strong story that goes back to our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. It's their story that we need to be telling. We need to teach couples to pray within their marriage. That's how you get to extraordinary. It really becomes as simple as that. What's the difference between an ordinary marriage, a good marriage, and an extraordinary one? It's couples that have taken the time to learn how to pray together. Why does that make a difference? Well, we began this by saying the secular world wanted to claim that word marriage. They wanted to redefine it. About 4 years ago, the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops was meeting in Baltimore. They were reviewing the revised text for the rite of marriage before it was sent over to Rome for further review. And those kind of texts go through multiple levels of review. And there was one of the bishops got up and he gave this really passionate appeal, because the bishops were considering calling this the nuptial rite as opposed to the marriage rite. And this bishop got out there in front of his brother bishops and he said, I don't want to give up that word. I don't want to give in to the secular world and say, okay, you can have the word marriage. You can redefine it and we'll call it nuptial rite. So every bride and groom comes in and said, I'm here to get nuptialed. That's not what they called it in Augustine's time. That's not what they called it in our parents' and grandparents' time. And it was really an interesting thing to listen to this bishop, and he was just an auxiliary from some diocese somewhere. It was his turn at the microphone. I happened to see it during a break in my classes at the seminary when I tuned in. It's like, oh, look what this guy's talking about. But it's a powerful message. We should not give up that term. It is the rite of marriage. We may have to clarify it for the secular world so that they yield a little bit when we talk about, we're talking about a sacramental marriage. And a sacramental marriage is something that we have owned for almost 2,000 years. We're not going to give it up to any government. We have to teach them the couple to pray, because no couple is in this alone. How many people have ever sat quietly by yourself and said the Lord's Prayer? That's all? Guess what? You're all wrong. You can't say the Lord's Prayer by yourself. What's the first word of it? Our. Who are you praying it with? Who taught us that prayer? Jesus. We can't say the Lord's Prayer in our mind quietly in a darkened room or with our head already on the pillow by ourselves. We say it with Jesus every time. No couple is in this alone. We have in the gospel, whenever two or more are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. Well, guess what? That's what a sacramental marriage is. It's two people, young, middle-aged, or old, who have come to church and they said, I want to get married in my church. I don't want to get married on the beach. I don't want to get married on the cruise ship. I don't want to get married by the justice of the peace. I want to get married in my church because I want the two of us to come together in Christ. Two coming together in my name, and there I am in their midst. So when that couple gets married in a sacramental marriage, they have to be reminded that guess who they bring to the 4th of July barbecue when they show up? Jesus. Guess who do they bring to the wild bachelor party later on for their friend who's getting married a year later? Yeah, Jesus is there too. They're not in it again, alone. That's how you get to have an extraordinary marriage. I'll go one step further. Having been married, having worked with a lot of married couples, and now being, in essence, single, although as a widower we could have a different kind of philosophical conversation about, to be a widower, am I still technically married in some fashion? I like to think so. But here's the thing. When I was married, I could have a different kind of prayer life because I could pray with my wife. I could pray about things together, and I can't do that now. She's not there in the same way. But as a couple, you have the opportunity of prayer. How many people, I don't know if they do it here at St. Gregory the Great, the general intercessions, the end of the last intercession, the last one is usually something like, and for the petitions held in the silence of our hearts, short pause. Every lector has to figure out how long or short is a short pause. We pray to the Lord. Boom. When you're standing there with your spouse and you have learned to pray together, you know the prayers in the hearts of that person you're standing next. Nobody else in church knows the prayers of anybody else's heart. But you as a couple, you do. If you want to be extraordinary. If you want to learn to pray together. One of the things that I have taught hundreds of couples over the years, in retreats, in preparation for marriage, is what I call praying silently out loud. Okay? This is how praying silently out loud works. It's a very simple thing. It has 3 rules. Catholic Church, we have rules. It just goes with it. The first rule is that you take turns. One night it's the bride, the next night it's the groom, one night it's the husband, the wife. You just alternate back and forth, okay? That's the easy rule. Second rule, and most of the couples I've taught this to have gotten into it for a while, they say this is the hardest one. When you say your prayers at night, and most of us have, or some time of the day when we pray to God, for most of us that's mental. You know, we're not actually on our knees muttering. It's in our mind we're having this conversation with God. When we do that, we never tell anybody else. There's not another single person on the face of planet Earth who's ever heard our prayers to God. Praying silently out loud, the second rule is that the prayers that you're going to offer to God on those alternating days, you say out loud for your spouse to hear. Ooh. I choose to share the innermost thoughts of my heart, the thoughts that I have previously in my life only shared with my God. I choose to share them with my spouse, or if you're engaged, with my fiancé. And what does that do? That opens up a level of trust that is far more intimate than anything that happened in the honeymoon suite. Okay? Remarkably different. And it's especially made so by rule number 3. Rule number 3, you cannot edit your spouse into the prayers if they're not already there. You can't get to the end and say, and Ellie too. Okay? Because that's the trust. If your prayer is about the meeting you're going to have on Thursday and you're really worried about it, if it goes well, you get a promotion. If it goes poorly, you lose your job. That's a cause of worry. If that's what you're praying for and you forgot to mention your spouse during that prayer, you know what? They'll understand. So you can't edit your spouse into the prayer. Now, the funny thing about that is that couples worry about that tremendously. They think that's going to be hurtful to the one they love. This one person that they're going to be lying in bed there next to, who is the one person on planet Earth they have decided that they love more than any of the other 9 billion or so. And if I don't mention the prayer, it's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt their heart. So you know what they do? They start thinking about how they're going to do that prayer at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, just so that it wasn't an afterthought. See, Father Jim was like, no, I didn't add them in. I've been thinking about them all afternoon. And God smiles. He says, oh. So you didn't just say your prayers at night at 11:15 when you're exhausted. You started praying them 8 hours before that. How cool is that? And those prayers you began 8 hours before that were for your spouse. That's even better. Do you think when you do that, you got a shot at having an extraordinary marriage? You've tilted the axis in your favor for sure. Okay? You've extraordinarily made it different. There's a final rule. And the final rule is this. When it's your turn to be the one you're taking, it's really part of the first rule of taking turns. When it's not your turn, you cannot comment on your spouse's prayer. They didn't let you listen to it for a comment. They didn't offer that prayer to you. It's still their prayer to God. It's their prayer to Jesus Christ in that relationship that is growing within the crucible that is your marriage. And within the crucible that is your marriage, you're not there to edit it or comment on it. You are in a sacredly privileged position to listen with your heart to the same prayer that your spouse is offering to their Savior. That's all. You're just listening. But they've trusted you with it. They've trusted you not to wrinkle it up and crush it. They've trusted you not to edit it. They've trusted you not to comment on it and say, oh, but honey, I got a better way to do that. Men, this is a real problem for us especially. Because typically we listen to 20% of the problem when we immediately begin trying to fix it. Even though we don't know what the real problem is, but we want to be heroes. We want to fix it. When you're listening to the prayers, you're not there to fix. You're not there to say, oh, okay, let me get up out of bed. I can go start working on that now. My wife's laying there, she's praying, I wish the dishwasher would have been installed already. I was like, oh, crap. I was supposed to do that last weekend. I better get up and get out the wrench. No, they're not asking for you to change what you're doing there. They're inviting you to listen to their prayers to God. You know, we have some wonderful, wonderful scripture passages that are where we get to hear, through the evangelist writing, we get to hear what Jesus is saying to his Father. There's one that I came upon a couple months ago that I really like. Jesus begins his conversation with his Father. He says, Father, these disciples are your gift to me. Wow. Did any of you think of yourselves at this very moment as a gift from the Father to Jesus? And yet that's how he thinks of you. And if he thinks of you that way, do you think when you invite him into your life and the married couple, into your life of prayer, that you have a shot at having an extraordinary marriage? Yes, you do. And that's why I say you should demand it of yourself. You should demand it of each other. And you can demand it of your church. Your church needs to support you in saying, you know, yeah, we'll help you pray together. We'll help you through rough patches in your marriage. You know, they happen. But two are gathered in my name to go forward. That's what I've got tonight, folks. I'm open to questions about anything I've shared with you. Ideas that you may have that you want to share of, if you have a way as couples who've prayed together in different ways, others may benefit from hearing from you. So your church is helping you if we created a space where you'd be able to just toss out an idea or two. Yes, sir?
Did you say it wasn't until the 5th century with St. Augustine that marriage was really defined? So I was just wondering what was occurring at the time of Jesus and Judaism.
Okay. So marriage, and Father Mike Hall's over there as our director of the Office of Worship. He might have a thing or two to add in on this. No, he doesn't. He's hiding. Rats. I'm on the spot again. No, so the church, in the early church, was wrestling with what are the sacraments. And in our Baltimore Catechism when I was growing up, a sacrament's an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. In the Protestant Reformation, we had a big split over what were the sacraments. How many sacraments does the Catholic Church have? Are you sure? If you read some of the Second Vatican Council documents, they call the Church a sacrament. That would make 8. If you go back to the Middle Ages in the time of like Peter Abelard and whatnot, we had 18. In fact, back then we had 2 different kinds of marriage sacraments, a high marriage and a low marriage. The high marriage was between 2 Catholics. The low marriage was between a Catholic and somebody who wasn't baptized, but it was still a sacrament. Now we say, well, that's a marriage, but it's not a sacrament, because sacraments have to be between 2 baptized people. So to answer your question, what was happening is for, 1,200 years or so from the time the church was begun, they've been wrestling with, well, what constitutes our sacraments? And in this case, what constitutes the sacrament of marriage? For the longest time, really up through like the Middle Ages, marriage as an institution was a civil thing. There were people who would secretly get married, and as a result of those secret marriages, they would, later on, there'd be questions about that. Okay, why would they get secretly married? Well, her father didn't like him. That happened. The princess ran off with the guy from the other side of the kingdom, and it's like, no, we'll start wars over that, so it's secret. There were secret marriages because if they became public, it could cause someone who is in hiding to be revealed. This is the stuff of legends and lore, and the guys running up through the mountains and the hills. There are still places where that happens, okay? That if someone became out into a sacramental marriage and became, in that process, you just revealed yourself to be a Christian. And some places, even today, being a Christian is grounds for being persecuted in some fashion, up to and including death and martyrdom. So the church really wasn't in the marriage business. But when they instituted the form of canon, the canonical form for marriage, which goes back to Pope Nicholas IV in around the 8th, 9th century time period, that's when they got rid of the secret marriages. Okay, so they said a marriage now has to be public. And the canonical form of our marriage is in front of the official witness of the church, which is a cleric, with 2 witnesses, that you exchange the consent. That's the canonical form of marriage. We have the rite that wraps that up beautifully into the liturgies that we have in church. But that rite became a thing in the Middle Ages when the church started to get more involved with it because it had to do with property. The secret marriages also came into play when somebody said after the so-and-so had died, we were married. That estate up on the hill, it's now mine. It's like, when were you married? How come nobody was there? Was the reception large? We were married in secret. So that's why the church basically said, hey, if the civil society is thrusting us in to be the keeper of this, there can be no more secret marriages. Now, part of the rationale behind why the church was the keeper of that, the church, even back then, was the best record keeper. That permanent record that the nuns told you about in 1st and 2nd grade, it exists. It's in a leather-bound book written by hand. Even the churches that have their records computerized, that's not the official copy. The official copy is the handwritten copy in the big leather binder in the vault. So for years, the church has been focused on that and saying, we're helping the civil society, and it became then the institution of the sacrament of marriage. Okay, but people were marrying in Roman times, people were marrying in other cultures outside of the Christian faith long before Augustine and Nicholas IV. When the church was legal, okay, it was legalized, and it became drawn into the question of, the propriety of things because of the civil marriages that were being claimed. They basically said, we can't let people claim that and have the church now be the one to, the visiting Friar Tuck married us when he passed through town 3 years ago, and that's why I should have that 40 acres of land. Who was Friar Tuck, and did he write anything down? So it got fishy, and the church basically said, we're not in the business of being clandestine. Okay, that answer your question? Yes. Good. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming out. Please do, when you hear that statistic, 50% of all marriages end in divorce, politely but passionately correct it. It's not true. It never was true. It's always been bad math. Thanks for coming.